Hi everybody, my name is Jim. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is December 20th, 1964. I've been sober through the grace of God since that time. Thank you, God, for that. I want to welcome you all here on All Hallows evening, which I think means that tomorrow is All Hallows Day. I think it's also an ancient Celtic holiday of some kind, or they probably were worshiping some of those graven images. I'm not sure. I don't really know how it came about that we took All Hallows evening and got a bunch of ghosts and goblins and skeletons out of it, but that's the way that one worked out. And I'm happy to see all of you here. Thought maybe you'd all be out trick or drinking. Oh no, trick or treating. You never did trick or drinking? Oh, that's a great way to party on Halloween evening. Anyway, tonight we're going to continue our study of the Big Book, and we're in Bill's story. We're right at the bottom of page 7. Let's kind of get caught up here a little bit, shall we? So far we've followed Bill through the odyssey of his drunkenness and the progression of his illness from the time he was a young lieutenant in the army that went over to France to fight the war that was going to end all wars. He came back filled with himself. He had had an experience in the Winchester Cathedral, which he doesn't talk about much in the Big Book, but in some other literature he describes it. And it sounds as if he had quite a strong spiritual experience while he was in the cathedral. Came back out, found the gravestone, which is quoted, more or less quoted accurately on the first page of his story. Probably the most famous gravestone in all of history. It appears in some 60 or 70 million books in 30 different languages, something like that. In any event, we follow Bill through his odyssey of power driving and ego and chasing dollars and chasing all of the renown that he could find, and he wanted to become a member of the club he used to envy, and he did that, and he learned to play golf, and all this time he was drinking more and more heavily. And then we remember we got to 1929, the great stock market crash. Of course, that really, Bill was pretty far gone with his drinking by that time anyway. And then he was barely eking it out for a while, but then eventually it turned out that pretty much Lois, his wife, was responsible for making enough money to pay the bills and keep him going. One of the great miracles of all time is she stayed with that guy. And of course it was only, as far as I'm concerned, it was a miracle. It was God's will, because without Lois, there's no doubt that Bill would have put himself 6 feet under. He went to the hospital, you remember, for the first time, and Dr. Silkworth took him through the whole course of treatment there at Towns Hospital. And during that time he was fed poison, they call it belladonna. And they did hot water and cold water, and they did aversion therapy, and they did psychotherapy, and they did all the stuff. And Bill thought when he came out of that treatment that he was cured, because he had a lot of knowledge then about why he drank and about what alcohol would do. But it was not very long before he was drunk again, and this went on for a while. Finally, in 1934, Bill got back into Towns Hospital in the late summer of 1934, and they tried again to help him, but at the end of that, then Dr. Silkworth took Bill and Lois aside, and he told them, said, look, you've got something here which we can't help you with. You are a chronic, hopeless alcoholic, and there's no cure for what you have. And I hate to tell you this, but if you don't stop drinking, you'll be dead within a year, or certainly locked up somewhere where you can't get hold of the booze. Now that was a very, very important thing that happened. And Dr. Silkworth later remarked upon this, because it led him to a belief which is incorporated now in our 7th chapter, and first came into play when Bill went to work with Dr. Bob. And that belief that came to Dr. Silkworth, we're going to see how it came about here in just a couple minutes when we get into the story of how Bill and Ebby got together. But keep in mind now that as Bill and Ebby get together, and we'll watch this as it happens in the book, that Ebby and Bill had been very close, and that they had many very serious drunks together, and Bill knew all about Ebby, and he knew he was as bad or worse than he was, knew that he had been a candidate for final disposition into some hellhole of an asylum somewhere. And so something had opened Bill's mind up enough that he was willing to listen. Dr. Silkworth believed, and I think we probably agree with him now, and certainly the Big Book agrees, that one of the essentials to breaking through the denial was for Bill to understand that he was no longer in a place where he could safely drink again, that he was hopeless, helpless, and that he had to be shocked into understanding that what was going on here was that he was suffering from a disease which was incurable and invariably fatal and progressive, and that he could not control his drinking on his own, that he had no way of refusing. Sooner or later the obsession compulsion would catch up with him. And so this softened him up, Dr. Silkworth thought, and in the 7th chapter, when we get there, we'll see the results of that, because we're directed in the 7th chapter to do exactly that, to take the new person through the horrors of alcoholism and explain exactly what's wrong with them and what's likely to happen if they don't stop. Eventually then Bill was released with this admonition that he had to stop or he'd be dead within a year. And down at the bottom of page 7, remember, that last full paragraph, the last 2 or 3 lines, my weary and despairing wife was informed that it would all end with heart failure during delirium tremens, or I would develop a wet brain, perhaps within a year. She would soon have to give me over to the undertaker or the asylum. They did not need to tell me. I knew and almost welcomed the idea. See, Bill is now approaching that place of hopelessness. And remember that what we read back in the forward of the first edition, the seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. Now, of course, that means that it seems hopeless to the alcoholic, but we know that it's not hopeless because we were there and now we are here. And so we use the appellation seemingly hopeless, since that is exactly the way it appears to the person who's still suffering out there. Bill says, it was a devastating blow to my pride. I, who had thought so well of myself and my abilities, of my capacity to surmount obstacles, was cornered at last. Now we can see the beginnings here of the first step for Bill, can't we? When he realizes that he knew at that time that he was cornered. Now I was to plunge into the dark, joining that endless procession of sots who had gone on before. I thought of my poor wife. There had been much happiness after all. What would I not give to make amends? But that was over now. We find him, you see, slipping further and further into this hopelessness and this depression, just giving up. No words can tell of the loneliness and despair I found in that bitter morass of self-pity. Quicksand stretched around me in all directions. I had met my match. I had been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. This, of course, is something which at the time Bill did not know what was happening to him. But when we look at his story and we understand what he's saying here, this is exactly what had to happen in order for Bill to reach that point of being able to say truthfully that I am powerless over alcohol. There's also, the big book is entirely consistent all the way through, and many times it repeats in different ways the same thoughts and ideas that it repeats earlier on. For example, let's take a look at Vision for You. First page is 151. And Bill was talking about the bitter morass of self-pity and quicksand stretched around me in all directions. On page 151, this is a wonderful dissertation here on exactly what Bill is talking about, expanding a little bit. Let's see what it says here. And by the way, when you think of a newcomer, always think of them reading the entire book, please. Not an expurgated Reader's Digest as your sponsor sees it version. Because everything in this book is meaningful and it's here for the newcomer to read. Let's look at the second paragraph on 151. The less people tolerated us, the more we withdrew from society, from life itself. As we became subjects of King Alcohol, shivering denizens of his mad realm, the chilling vapor that is loneliness settled down. It thickened, ever becoming blacker. Some of us sought out sordid places, hoping to find understanding, companionship, and approval. Momentarily we did. Then would come oblivion, and the awful awakening to face the hideous four horsemen: terror, bewilderment, frustration, despair. Unhappy drinkers who read this page will understand. And I think we probably all ought to understand that those four horsemen are right out there in the parking lot, and they're doing drag races up and down the parking lot, staying in shape. They want us. They want us bad. After all, while we're in here, they're unemployed, aren't they? Let's keep it that way, shall we? I don't think any of us ever want to try to ride one of those horses again. All right. So there are several other places which are aptly descriptive of what Bill is saying here, but I think that particular paragraph goes right to the point. Now here he is. He's coming out of the hospital. And he says, trembling, this one back on page 8 now, trembling, I stepped from the hospital a broken man. Fear sobered me for a bit. That's important. We got to stop right there and think about this for a second. You see what a terrible, terrible mistake it is to believe that fear will keep us sober? That's just simply not true. Fear of the consequences of our next drink, fear of the consequences of our next debauch, our next run, the fear of going to jail, the fear of the next DUI, losing our jobs, losing our families, being held up to the ridicule of the community, being sick, being terribly sick, being hung over, all those fears. And not one of them is enough to keep us sober. Not for very long. But for the temporary, just for that first little time when we first come in, maybe then fear is the powerful force that drives us in here. But once we're here, somebody in here, or somebody's got to get hold of us and say, now let's sit down and let's see what we've really got here. We want to tell you our story. We're not making any judgments about you, but you're here, and if you'd like to, let us tell you what happened with us. And then we tell them how we drank, and how alcohol affected us, and how it darn near killed us, and how we tried to stop and could not stop. And we tell them what we have, and if you're an alcoholic, what you have is a deadly, incurable, progressive illness. And it never gets any better. And if you're still interested, we'll tell you how we recovered. And if you're still interested after all of that, we'll give you a book and say, read the book. because at some point, very quickly after a newcomer hits the door, we must stop pandering to fear. And we must stop telling people that they can stay sober because they're afraid of the results of getting drunk. That is not the AA program. And as a matter of fact, the truth of it is, except in a very short period of time when it may be the inducement to get in here, fear is our enemy. It's the only enemy we've got. If there is a devil, his name is fear. Certainly one of his names. And so we have to be real careful about this. Fear sobered me a bit, he says, back on page 8. Then came the insidious insanity of that first drink. And on Armistice Day 1934, I was off again. Armistice Day in 1934 was November 11th, and the Armistice Day was a day commemorating the armistice in the First World War. And I believe now it's the same day we call Veterans Day. But in those days it was Armistice Day. So we know that on November 11th, 1934, Bill picked up the next drink. I was off again. Everyone became resigned to the certainty that I would have to be shut up or up somewhere, or would stumble along to a miserable end. How dark it is before the dawn. In reality, that was the beginning of my last debauch. I was soon to be catapulted into what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. You know, one of the things this big book does, and does so well, better than anything I know, it brings hope. You see, right here now is the beginning of the hope that Bill is going to bring to the newcomer who reads his story. Remember, coming from a place of seeming hopelessness, one of the things that must happen for the new person is that they must begin to feel hope. They must also, of course, be free of the denial which has kept them drunk all this time. So the big book will help them break down the walls of denial, but for sure it brings them hope. Here are all these people who are real people who are telling them that they were just as bad, and yet they have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. Now we go back to Bill's story. Near the end of that bleak November, I sat drinking in my kitchen. With a certain satisfaction, I reflected there was enough gin concealed about the house to carry me through that night and the next day. My wife was at work. I wondered whether I dared hide a full bottle of gin near the head of our bed. I would need it before daylight. My musing was interrupted by the telephone. The cheery voice of an old school friend asked if he might come over. He was sober. It was years since I could remember his coming to New York in that condition. I was amazed. Rumor had it that he had been committed for alcoholic insanity. I wondered how he'd escaped. Of course, he would have dinner, and then I could drink openly with him. Unmindful of his welfare, well, of course, Bill, you were totally buried in self at that time, weren't you? Unmindful of his welfare, I thought only of recapturing the spirit of other days. There was that time we had chartered an airplane to complete a Jag. By the way, a Jag does not mean one of those English cars, or one of those cats that you find out in the jungle. That's just an old-fashioned word for a drunk. His coming was an oasis in this dreary desert of futility, the very thing an oasis. Drinkers are like that. Now then, here's where it all starts for Bill. And all starts for us, right here. The door opened and he stood there, fresh-skinned and glowing. There was something about his eyes. He was inexplicably different. What had happened? I pushed the drink around across the table. He refused it. Disappointed but curious, I wondered what had got into the fellow. He wasn't himself. Come, "What's all this about?" I queried. He looked straight at me, simply but smiling. He said, "I've got religion." Well, you can imagine, Bill says, I was aghast. So that was it. Last summer an alcoholic crackpot. Now I suspect a little cracked about religion. He had that starry-eyed look. Yes, the old boy was on fire all right, but bless his heart, let him rant. Besides, my gin would last longer than his preaching. He did no ranting. In a matter-of-fact way, he told how two men had appeared in court persuading the judge to suspend his commitment. That was Roland Hazard and a friend from the Oxford group. They had told of a simple religious idea and a practical program of action. That was 2 months ago, and the result was self-evident. It worked. And therefore, when Ebby said, "I've got religion," he wasn't kidding. He joined a religious movement. And when Bill talks about a simple religious idea, please, if you're new, don't be misled. This program of Alcoholics Anonymous is not religious, nor is AA in any sense of the word a religion. And we have members who profess and practice just about every religion there is, and many no religion at all. And so we have absolutely no connection with any established religion or any established anything else for that matter. We stand absolutely alone with God. That's where we stand. He had come to pass his experience along to me, if I cared to have it. I was shocked, but interested. Certainly I was interested. I had to be, for I was hopeless. There we go. We've been waiting for that. He talked for hours. Childhood memories rose before me. Now this paragraph is very important because it lays the foundation for us to understand Bill in his dilemma, his spiritual dilemma. He did have a problem, big problem. We'll see how that works out. I could almost hear the sound of the preacher's voice as I sat on still Sundays way over there on the hillside. He was there with his grandfather most times. They liked to hear it, but they didn't want to participate. There was that proffered temperance pledge I never signed, and his grandfather's good-natured contempt of some church folk and their doings, his insistence that the Spears really had their music, but his denial of the preacher's right to tell him how he must listen. And his grandfather apparently was at least an agnostic. His fearlessness as he spoke of these things just before he died. What Bill is telling us here is that his grandfather did not, upon his deathbed, pander to the idea of God in order to, in one way or another, to save himself. These recollections welled up from the past. They made me swallow hard. Oh, that wartime day in old Winchester at the cathedral came back again. Now here we see Bill in his dilemma. I had always believed in a power greater than myself. I had often pondered these things. I was not an atheist. Few people really are, for that means blind faith in the strange proposition that this universe originated in a cipher and aimlessly rushes nowhere. My intellectual heroes, the chemists, the astronomers, even the evolutionists, suggested vast laws and forces at work. Despite contrary indications, I had little doubt that a mighty purpose and rhythm underlay all. How could there be so much of precise and immutable law and no intelligence? I simply had to believe in a spirit of the universe who knew neither time nor limitation. But that was as far as I had gone. Now, this is not something which is that unusual. There are, in my experience, there are very few people who are truly atheistic in the sense that they just maintain there is no God, period. nothing to argue about. God does not exist. God isn't dead, he just never was. Or it never was. Most people who are having this kind of difficulty, in my experience anyway, has been that they believe that there may be this czar of the heavens, or this power that created it all and keeps it all running, but cannot conceive of this gigantic power having anything to do with them personally. You see, that's the problem. A God personal to each of us. With ministers and the world's religions, I parted right there. When they talked of a God personal to me, who was love, superhuman strength and direction, I became irritated and my mind snapped shut against such a theory. To Christ I conceded the certainty of a great man, not too closely followed by those who claimed him. His moral teaching most excellent. For myself I had adopted those parts which seemed convenient and not too difficult. The rest I disregarded. And boy, that sounds familiar. The wars which had been fought, the burnings and chicanery that religious dispute had facilitated made me sick. I honestly doubted whether on balance the religions of mankind had done any good. Judging from what I'd seen in Europe and since, the power of God in human affairs was negligible. The brotherhood of man a grim jest. If there was a devil, he seemed the boss universal, and he certainly had me. But my friend, now here we go. Here's Ebby now. This is 12-step work at its initial, right at the beginning, right as everything is starting for us. And it's wonderful what happened. My friend sat before me, and he made the point-blank declaration that God had done for him what he could not do for himself. See how powerful that was? And Bill was listening to him. Bill's believing him because Ebby had credibility with Bill. Bill had to believe him. He knew that something had happened here. This was a terrible drunk who couldn't stop drinking. Here he was. His human will had failed. How many times are we going to hear that repeated now in this book? Over and over and over again. We cannot stop drinking on willpower alone. Our human will fail. Doctors had pronounced him incurable, as he obviously was. Society is about to lock him up. Like myself, he had admitted complete defeat. Now here is Bill telling us flat out, he's taken the first step. He has admitted complete defeat. Then he had in effect been raised from the dead, suddenly taken from the scrap heap to a level of life better than the best he had ever known. Had this power originated in him? Obviously it had not. There had been no more power in him than there was in me at that moment, and this was none at all. Here we go, you see, powerlessness. And later on in the 4th chapter, we're going to read the epitome of this, that this was our problem, lack of power. That was our dilemma. And so we're going to start there next week when we come back. And we're going to see Bill take his second step, and then we're going to watch him as he goes to the hospital, and he works the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 11th steps, and then the 12th step while he's still in the hospital. And we'll see all of that as it unfolds before us in Bill's story. And I thank you so much for listening. I plan to be back here, God willing, and a creek don't rise, and I hope you will be too. Thank you. I don't know, I guess I'm up here. Where's my guy? Well, all right, look. We need to get someone up here to do the chips tonight. Who wants to do that? Oh, here he comes. All right.
No, we don't.
I don't know.
Okay. All right.
I'm a newcomer around this
room. Do the chips.
Oh.
If you haven't had a chance to share, don't take it home. And would like to do the chips. Want to do the chips? Yeah, do the chips. Yeah, you gotta do the chips. Come on, do the chips. Do the chips.
My name is Andre. I'm an alcoholic. Apparently, I'm in South Florida that they do this chip system. Up in New York, they don't do this. And the white one, which is the international color for surrender for anything. Would you like to surrender to power greater than you? Anybody? Okay. If you have 30 days continuous sobriety, you got a silver chip. Anybody would like to pick up a silver chip for 30 days? Okay, what's next? Blue?
The red chip.
Red chip for 90 days. Anybody have 90 days? Pick up a red chip. Okay. Keep coming back, right?
Yeah.
Blue chip is what, 6 months?
Yeah.
There you go.
Peter.
This is Peter. Another one was 6 months. No. Anybody else? 6 months? Okay. There's purple chip for 9 months. Anybody have 9 months? Okay. If you had 1 year or more sobriety, you can celebrate this group. You have to put your name on a blackboard, and the last Sunday of the month, you celebrate it. Thank you.
Dave, thank you for a great meeting. Anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all our traditions, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities. What you see here, what you hear here, let it stay here.
That's it, baby.
You got 18 laps there.
I'd love to see that, man. I'd love to see it.
Hey, Jim.
I'm not saying you should do that in the beginning. All right, I got one there for 5. But it's because they work the steps. You know you can work the time on the rock call. Yeah. What did you say? Think about meetings.
I have to carry this message down. Oh, where you go?
I work with a guy right now. Basically,
You're working for
Girlfriend likes this.
most people do.
I'm here. I know I can't hold it early, so. Yeah, hey man.
Oh, he wanted you would actually make sure that I was making a copy of
There he is. Hector. I know. It's a great shopping
making it time for coffee. Between the no nuts and the real good. A little above the middle.
I've got them here too.
Oh, good.
Give me that's for me.
Okay,
How you feeling tonight? How are you? Good, I'm glad to see you too.
Happy to be alive.
I don't know what the hell's going on here, but okay, everybody, let's settle down. I'm spoiled in this group. There's always been somebody up here to open it and close it, but looks like